He had nothing but a cracked court, a worn-out ball, and sneakers held together with tape. Yet every night, when the rest of the neighborhood retreated indoors, Jamal stayed dribbling until his fingers went numb, chasing a dream that no one else could see. To the world, he was just another kid with nothing. But out there, under the flickering streetlights and the crooked hoop, he was something more. What he didn't know was that someone was watching him, that this broken court was about to change his life forever. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Court sat at the very edge of the neighborhood, just before the cracked asphalt road gave way to an empty stretch of weeds and rusting street signs. It had been there longer than anyone could remember. A slab of concrete baked pale by summers and split by winters that froze water deep into its surface. The lines that once marked the boundaries of the court had faded into ghost traces, visible only when the light hit them just right. The hoop leaned slightly forward on its rusted pole. The metal backboard pocked with dents, its paint peeled away to reveal dull gray beneath. The chain net hung unevenly, rattling in the breeze, like loose change in a pocket. A chain-link fence surrounded the space on three sides, bent in places where time and people had pushed against it. Beyond it, a small patch of grass tried to grow through the dirt. But mostly it was a place where wind tossed plastic bags to get caught in the wires. Jamal was there again. It's the same way he was most evenings, when the sky turned the color of ash and orange, and the rest of the neighborhood retreated indoors. 14 years old, his frame still lanky and in between, he moved with the kind of restless energy that had nowhere else to go. His hoodie hung loose on his shoulders, the sleeves pushed up past his elbows. His sneakers, if they could still be called that, were split along the soles, tape winding around them in two places to keep them from falling apart completely. Each step on the court gave off a dull thud from the worn rubber, and each bounce of the basketball carried a hollow sound, the ball itself scuffed and faded from years of play. It was the only ball he owned, and he'd had it for as long as he could remember. He dribbled without looking down, weaving the ball from one hand to the other in a rhythm that had become second nature. His breaths came in steady bursts, white in the cooling air, and his eyes were fixed on the crooked hoop. Every few seconds he stepped back and took a shot, the ball arcing high against the dimming sky. Sometimes it dropped clean through the net with a metallic whisper. Other times it clanged hard against the rim, rebounding toward the fence. Each time he chased it down without complaint, his sneakers scraping the concrete, his focus never breaking. No one was there to cheer him on or tell him to keep going, but he didn't need it. Jamal played for the sound of the ball leaving his hands just right, for the brief moment when it hung in the air, and anything felt possible. He had no proper gear, no coach, and no team to call his own, but none of that mattered when he was on this court. Here, he wasn't the kid who couldn't afford the league fees, who wore the same hoodie to school 3 days in a row. Here, he was just a player, chasing a feeling that made everything else fade. The streetlights along the road flickered to life one by one, throwing uneven patches of light across the court. Moths circled in the glow, their shadows darting over the cracked surface. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm blared and then abruptly stopped. Jamal kept moving, dribbling, pivoting, shooting. The sound of the ball echoed against the empty lot, a steady, lonely beat that filled the space like music only he could hear. He stayed long past the point, when the air turned sharp and the night pressed in, long past, when most kids his age would have gone home for dinner. The cold made his fingers stiff, but he kept shooting, kept running drills he'd pieced together from videos on a borrowed phone. The court, for all its brokenness, was the one place that felt his. It didn't care about the things he didn't have. It didn't judge the way his shoes were held together or how his ball had lost its color. It just gave him a place to play, and for Jamal, that was enough. By the time he finally picked up the ball and tucked it under his arm, the street was empty and the sky above had deepened to a dark navy. The chain net swayed gently in the breeze, and the court, once alive with the sound of the game, fell silent again. Jamal glanced back at it before stepping off the concrete, knowing he'd be back tomorrow and the day after that, as long as he could. The final bell of the day never rang loud enough to drown out the sound of sneakers scraping linoleum as students poured into the hallway, shouting to each other, slamming locker doors, dragging their bags along the floor. Jamal slipped through the crowd without stopping, the strap of his backpack pulled tight over his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the exit. Outside, the air carried the lingering warmth of the afternoon, but the sun was already sliding low, brushing the tops of the buildings with a fading orange light. He glanced at his watch. 10 minutes until the last bus. He broke into a jog, leaving past groups of kids, still hanging around, laughing, scrolling through their phones, with no urgency to be anywhere. Jamal's urgency was constant. Last bus wasn't something you missed unless you wanted to spend the next hour walking home. Through streets that felt longer when the sun dipped below the horizon, he cut across the parking lot, the uneven asphalt making his taped-up sneakers slap awkwardly against the ground. The bus stop sat at the far end of the block, a simple metal bench beneath a cracked glass shelter that had been tagged over with layers of graffiti. An older man in a heavy jacket sat hunched over on one side, staring at the ground. Jamal stood a few feet away, bouncing lightly on his toes, scanning the street for the familiar blur of yellow. He could hear the low hum of traffic from the main road, but no sign of the bus yet. Some days it came early, forcing him to sprint the last block with his chest burning. Other days, it crawled along like it had nowhere better to be. On this day, it was on time. The bus groaned to a stop, and Jamal climbed aboard, swiping his student pass before sinking into a seat near the back. He pressed his forehead lightly to the glass, watching the city slide by in streaks of light and shadow. The ride took about 20 minutes. Weaving through neighborhoods where the houses sat close together and the paint peeled along the edges. On certain blocks, porches sagged under the weight of years, and chain-link fences leaned into the sidewalks. It was the part of the city where people kept to themselves, where you learned to mind your own business. Jamal knew these streets well, enough to walk them blindfolded, which was good, because sometimes, when the bus was full or the schedule was off, he had no choice but to make the trek on foot. On those days, he cut through side streets, past shuttered storefronts with papered over windows, and over the pedestrian bridge that rattled when heavy trucks passed beneath. He kept his hood up, ball under his arm, head down, moving with the steady pace of someone who didn't want to draw attention. It was longer and colder than the bus ride, but he never complained about it to his mother. Renee already worked enough hours to fill the jobs, and most nights, by the time he got home, she was still at the hospital. Their apartment was on the second floor of a brick building with thin walls that let in the sound of neighbors arguing or televisions blaring too, doors down. Jamal unlocked the door quietly, stepping into the dim, still air. The small kitchen was neat, except for the note stuck to the fridge with a magnet in the shape of a stethoscope. It was her handwriting, slanted but clear. Dinner's in the fridge. Be home late, love you. He pulled the door open and saw a plate covered in foil, leftover pasta, probably from the night before. He ate standing at the counter, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. In the living room, his backpack slumped against the couch, waiting for him to finish homework. He could still smell the faint trace of his mother's perfume, mixed with the sterile scent that clung to her hospital scrubs. She had been leaving. Meals like this, for as long as he could remember, a quiet ritual that said what there wasn't time to say out loud. After eating, he rinsed the plate and set it in the sink, then glanced out the window at the darkening street. The day was almost gone, but he still had enough light for a little more time on the court. That was the rhythm of his life. School, bus, home, court, every day, repeating itself like a drill, steady and unchanging. Even as everything around him seemed fragile enough to break, Jamal kept his shoes tucked under his bed when he wasn't wearing them, partly to keep them out of the way, and partly because he didn't want to be reminded of how bad they'd gotten. They weren't even a real pair anymore, was an old hand-me down from his cousin. The other bought at a thrift store for a couple of dollars. Close enough in color that no one would notice unless they looked too closely. The laces didn't match either. One was frayed and thin, gray from years of dirt and weather, the other thicker and stiff, bright white only because it had been pulled from a different, newer sneaker that had long since fallen apart, The soles had started to peel away months ago. At first, it was just a small flap on the right shoe that caught on the court every now and then. He told himself he'd fix it later, but later never came. Instead, the flap grew, and then the left shoe followed, the rubber separating from the stitching like it was giving up. That was when he started using the tape. He kept a roll of black electrical tape in his bag, wrapping it tight around the shoes before every game or practice session. The tape squeaked as it stretched, binding the sneakers together in uneven layers that made them look more like patched-up work boots than basketball shoes. Each time he taped them, he told himself it was temporary, just until he could save enough for a new pair. But saving money wasn't simple when every bit he earned from odd jobs went to things the house actually needed. New shoes didn't rank high on that list, at least not when the old ones still worked if you wrap them up right. He didn't complain to his mother either. Renee already worked herself to exhaustion to keep a roof over their heads. The last thing he wanted was to make her feel like she wasn't doing enough, so he kept quiet. At school, he changed fast. In the locker room, keeping his head down so no one would notice the condition of his sneakers. On the court, he played hard enough that people paid attention to the ball in his hands instead of his feet. If anyone made a comment, he shrugged it off or laughed like it didn't bother him. Pride was a tricky thing. It could make you hide the worst of what you had and stand taller in the face of it, even when you were one loose step away from feeling the concrete through your socks. Some days, especially when the weather was bad, the tape would loosen mid-game. He'd hear the faint rip of the adhesive giving way, and his foot would slide just slightly in the shoe. It never stopped him. If anything, it made him push harder, because he refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him pause. The game, he'd sit on the edge of the court, peel the ruined tape away, and rewrap the shoes for the next day. It was a small, unspoken routine, one of the countless ways he learned to stretch what little he had. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, he sometimes caught himself scrolling through photos of the latest sneakers on his cracked phone. Screen, the clean lines, the fresh soles, the way the colors popped it, wasn't just about the look. It was about what they represented. Stepping onto the court without worrying about whether your shoes would hold up. But Jamal never let the thought sit too long. Wanting was dangerous. It made you restless, and restlessness could lead to asking. And asking meant putting weight on someone who already carried too much. The truth was, those shoes mismatched, taped, and battered had been with him through every game he'd ever played. They'd pounded the same cracked court outside his neighborhood 1,000 times. They'd carried him through the sting of losses and the quiet triumph of sinking a perfect shot when no one was watching. They were part of him now, just as much as his ball, his hoodie, and the rhythm he kept in his head when he played. And until the day they finally fell apart completely, he was going to keep lacing them up, wrapping the tape tight, walking out onto the court like they were brand new. The wind had picked up as the evening deepened, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and the low hum of traffic from the main road.
Ow.
Jamal was too focused to notice. The ball slapped against the cracked concrete in a steady rhythm, the sound echoing against the chain-link fence. He moved with quick darting steps, dribbling between his legs, spinning, stopping short before launching a shot that arced high toward the leaning hoop. The ball clanged off the rim, bounced once, and rolled toward the edge of the court. Chased it down without missing a beat, scooping it up and returning to his spot as if the miss had never happened. Across the street, partially hidden by the shadow of a burned-out street lamp, a figure stood motionless. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands tucked into the pocket of a dark hoodie, he looked like just another passerby pausing for a moment before moving on. But he wasn't passing through. He had been there for over 20 minutes, leaning casually against a light pole, his face angled toward the court. Every time Jamal made a move, every crossover, every shot, every quick pivot, the man's eyes tracked it closely, as though cataloging each detail. Marcus Hale had stood in more arenas than he could count. He had felt the roar of 50,000 voices in his ears, the weight of championship games on his shoulders, and the sting of losses that stayed with him for years. He had been a name printed on jerseys, the kind of player kids pretended to be when they played alone in their driveways. But that part of his life was over now. The world knew him as a retired NBA champion turned advocate for youth sports. A man who'd made it his mission to find kids who had the skill and drive, but not the means. And now, in this forgotten corner of the city, he thought he might have found one. The boy moved differently than most kids his age. Marcus could see it immediately. There was no hesitation in the way Jamal handled the ball, no fear of the rough, uneven surface beneath his feet. His form wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was an instinct in the way he played that couldn't be taught. Marcus had watched hundreds of young athletes over the years, and most of them, even the talented ones, would glance around to see who was watching before trying something bold. This boy never looked up. He wasn't showing off for anyone. He was here for the game and the game alone. A car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the fence and lighting Marcus's face for the briefest moment before darkness swallowed it again. He pulled his hood lower, not out of secrecy, but because he didn't want the boy to notice him. Not yet. Observation came first. Marcus believed in seeing a player as they were when no one else was looking. That's when you learned who they really were. Jamal missed another shot, the ball bouncing toward the fence. Instead of letting it roll out, he sprinted for it, sliding on the worn concrete to stop it just before it slipped away. Marcus noticed. The shoes immediately patched with tape, one lace gray and thin, the other white and thick. It made his jaw tighten, but he kept watching. A lot of kids in his foundation had come from situations like that. Some had even shown up barefoot. What mattered wasn't the gear they had, but the fire in their eyes when they played. The street around them was quiet now, save for the sound of the ball and the occasional whisper of wind through the fence. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, crossing his arms. It intended to only stay a few minutes, but there was something about this boy, this way of moving, this relentless push against his own limits that kept him rooted in place. Jamal took another shot. This time it dropped clean through the chain net with a sharp metallic swish. Marcus allowed himself a small smile in the dark. He didn't know the kid's name yet, didn't know his story, where he went to school, or whether he even played for a team. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the last time he'd be standing here. Watching from the shadows, the court was quiet except for the steady, rhythmic slap of the ball against the concrete. Jamal had long since stopped noticing. The cold creeping in from the edges of the evening. His hoodie clung to his back with sweat, his breath puffing in short, even bursts as he moved. He kept his eyes forward, body low, the ball gliding between his hands in a series of quick, precise dribbles. It was the same routine he ran every day, no matter the weather, no matter how tired he was from school or the walk home. He started with crossovers, left to right, right to left, over and over until the motion felt like second nature. His feet shuffled in perfect time with the ball, sliding just enough to keep his stance balanced. He didn't count how many times. He did it, he never did. The point wasn't hitting a number, it was hitting that invisible place where his body moved without thinking, where the ball became an extension of his hands. From there, he moved to spins, planting his foot, pivoting, sharply letting the ball roll from one palm to the other as he twisted back toward the hoop. The court surface was rough in places and slick in others, so he adjusted without even looking down, changing the weight in his steps to keep from slipping. It wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. He was learning how to control. Ball anywhere on any ground. When he practiced shots, he didn't just stand in the same safe spot. He moved along the perimeter, picking points that seemed ridiculous to triangles, so sharp he could barely see the rim. Spots where cracks in the concrete made his footing uneven. He'd seen professionals do it in grainy YouTube clips, the kind filmed in dimly lit gyms or during streetball tournaments on blacktops that looked just like his court. He studied those videos late at night, memorizing how they set their feet, how their shoulders turned just before release, the exact flick of the wrist that sent the ball spinning clean through the net. His execution wasn't always smooth. Sometimes the ball slipped off his fingers, hitting the rim so hard it bounced all the way to the fence. Sometimes the spin was off, and it caught too much iron before falling away. But Jamal never paused long enough to be frustrated. He chased the ball down, jogged back to his spot, and take the shot again, adjusting until the muscle memory began. To form layups came next. Right hand, left hand, high off the glass, straight into the hoop. He practiced them with both speed and control, pushing himself to get from the three-point line to the basket in as few steps as possible. In his head, he imagined defenders cutting him off, forcing him to shift directions or switch hands midair. Each time he landed, he was already backing up, ready to go again. The drills bled together as the light dimmed. Dribbles into pull-ups, step-backs into long-range shots, quick fakes followed by sudden bursts toward the basket. He worked until his legs felt heavy, until his forearms burned from the constant pounding of the ball against the ground. Movement was raw, unpolished, but there was something in the way he played, a sharpness, a focus that didn't come from formal training. It came from repetition, from hours spent chasing perfection without a coach or a whistle to push him by. The time he slowed, the sky had turned a deep blue, the first stars just beginning to appear overhead. Jamal stood near the free throw line, ball resting against his hip, chest rising and falling in steady breaths. He looked at the hoop one last time, then took a single shot. The ball sailed high, spinning just the way he wanted, and dropped clean. Through the chain net with a metallic swish. He didn't smile, didn't raise his hands in celebration. He just picked up the ball and tucked it under his arm, satisfied in the quiet way that came from knowing he'd earned. Every drop of sweat clinging to his skin. The ball was still warm in Jamal's hands from the last shot when he heard voices coming from the sidewalk. They were loud, carrying the easy swagger of boys who didn't care who heard them. He turned his head just enough to see three of them crossing the street toward the court. All older, all taller, and all dressed like they'd come straight from somewhere they wanted to be seen. Their sneakers were spotless, their jerseys bright and crisp, the kind you only bought if you didn't mind dropping real money. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered guy in a red hoodie, pushed the gate open with his foot and stepped onto the court like it belonged to him. The other two followed, one in a backward cap and the other chewing gum with his hands stuffed in his pockets. They didn't start playing right away. They looked around, taking in the cracked surface, the bent hoop, and finally, Jamal standing there in his taped-up sneakers and worn hoodie. "Yo," Red Hoodie called out, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Nice shoes, man." "What are those? Limited edition falling apart?" his friend snickered. Jamal bounced the ball once, letting it echo across the empty court. He didn't respond. He'd heard worse before from people who meant it more backward. Cap tilted his head. "We're running a game. Court's ours now." Jamal straightened. "Court's open to anyone," he said, his voice calm but steady. That got a laugh from all three. Gum Chewer stepped forward, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "All right, little man. You want to stay? Play us first to 11? Jamal could have walked away. Would have been easier, maybe even smarter. But something about the way they stood there, so sure of themselves, so sure he'd fold, made him grip the ball a little tighter. "Fine," he said. "First to 11. They didn't bother hiding their amusement as they spread out, one of them tossing the ball to Jamal like they were humoring a kid at a family picnic. He caught it, dropped into a low stance, and started dribbling. The first move came quicker. Crossover into a spin-catching Gum Chewer flat-footed. Jamal rose for the jumper and sank it clean. The laughter died a little. Red Hoodie called for the ball next possession, backing Jamal toward the hoop with his size. He scored, grinning like that was the end of the contest. But Jamal didn't let it rattle him. He took the ball at the top of the key, faked left, blew past backward cap, and banked the shot high off the glass. The game shifted. The older boys still talked, but their voices were sharper now, less playful. They started defending harder, throwing their weight around, but Jamal met them at every step. His dribbling was tight, his footwork sharp from hours of practicing alone. He darted into open spaces before they could close them, hitting shots from angles they didn't expect. By the time the score was tied at 9, sweat was dripping down all their faces, breaths coming fast. Jamal's legs burned, but he didn't let it show. The ball found his hands again. He dribbled low, waiting for the opening. Red Hoodie lunged in, but Jamal stepped back just enough, released the shot, watched it drop through the net with a metallic swish. Game point. The older boys didn't say much as they grabbed their stuff. Red Hoodie gave him a nod that wasn't quite friendly, but wasn't dismissive either. The three of them walked off, their voices fading into the street. Jamal stood alone again on the court, chest heaving, ball in hand. Didn't celebrate, didn't call anyone to brag. He just turned back toward the hoop and took another shot, letting the chain net sing in the quiet. The ball's echo faded into the stillness, leaving only the faint rattle of the chain net swaying in the breeze. Jamal bent to pick it up, his chest still rising and falling from the game, sweat cooling fast on his skin. The older boys were already halfway down the block, their voices drifting away into the quiet stretch of street. He didn't watch them go, just tucked the ball under his arm and started toward the gate, his taped-up sneakers scuffing softly against the worn concrete. The sky was almost fully dark now, the last threads of daylight sinking behind the low row of buildings. The street lamps buzzed faintly, their light catching on the bent sections of the chain-link fence. Jamal pushed the gate open, its hinges creaking in protest, and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. His mind wasn't on the win, or even the shots that had sealed it. That was just the game. He'd played harder ones, and he'd lost his share too. All that mattered was that he'd held his ground. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and started walking, rolling his shoulders against the chill that had settled in. The ball thumped lightly against his side with each step, the familiar weight a small comfort. The street was quiet except for the faint hum of a distant car engine. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice, then fell silent again. Behind him, just a few feet from the fence, Marcus Hale hadn't moved. He was still leaning casually against the metal, his hands in the front pocket of his dark hoodie. The hood's shadow kept his face hidden, but his eyes stayed fixed on Jamal's retreating figure. He'd seen every moment of the game. Way the boy adjusted to the older player's size. How he read their movements before they could cut him off. The quiet confidence that never wavered even when they tried to muscle him out. It wasn't polished skill, but it was raw instinct. It's the kind you couldn't fake. Marcus let his hands slip free, slow and deliberate, and brought them together in a single, soft clap. The sound was small, almost swallowed by the night, but it was enough. It was the kind of acknowledgement meant for no one's ears but his own. It's a silent agreement that what he'd seen was worth noting. He stayed a moment longer, watching as Jamal reached the corner and turned out of sight. There was something in the boy's stride that stuck with him. No celebration, no glance back at the court, just a steady walk forward, like it was only one step in a much longer road. Marcus had seen plenty of young players treat every game like a performance, chasing the approval of whoever might be watching. He wasn't playing for an audience. He was playing because it was the only way he knew how to be. The breeze picked up, rattling the loose sections of the fence. Marcus pulled his hood a little lower and stepped back from the pole, his sneakers crunching softly against the grit scattered along the curb. His car was parked a few houses down, a dark shape beneath a flickering streetlight. He didn't hurry. He never did after moments like this. By the time he reached the car, Jamal was long gone. Somewhere in the maze of narrow streets that led back toward the apartment blocks. Marcus unlocked the door, slid inside, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, the faint echo of the game replaying in his mind. There was no question now, he'd be back. He wanted to see more, when the engine finally turned over. Its low rumble cut through the quiet for just a moment before fading into the distance. The court behind him was dark again, the fence still swaying slightly where he'd leaned against it, the night settling back into its usual stillness as if nothing had happened at all. The hallway leading to the apartment smelled faintly of cooking, oil, and something burnt, the kind of scent that lingered no matter how many times the windows were opened. Jamal climbed the last flight of stairs 2 at a time, his ball tucked under his arm, his hoodie clinging to him from the evening's chill. When he reached their door, he fished the key from his pocket and slipped inside, the hinges giving their usual soft groan. The place was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp on the counter. Their apartment wasn't much, just a kitchen that opened into a living room. A narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, but it was what they had, and Jamal knew every inch of it like the back of his hand. His basketball bag sat just inside the doorway, right where he'd dropped it that morning. He set the ball on top of it, the dull sound of rubber against fabric breaking the quiet. On the kitchen table, his textbooks and notebooks were spread out in a haphazard pile, open to half-finished assignments. He slid into the chair closest to the wall, pulling one toward him, but his mind wasn't on the math problems in front of him. Numbers blurred together as his thoughts drifted back to the game. The older boys' smirks, the way they'd sized him up, the way the court had gone silent when that final shot dropped. A small flicker of satisfaction warmed his chest, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't planning on telling his mom about it. The fridge hummed softly behind him. He got up and opened it, scanning the shelves. A covered plate sat in the middle with his name written on a strip of masking tape. He lifted the foil and found roasted chicken with rice, the smell filling the small kitchen as he set it in the microwave. The timer beeped, and he returned to his seat, tapping his pencil against the page while the hum of the appliance filled the room. The front door clicked, opened just as he was scribbling down an answer. Renee stepped inside, closing the door behind her with her hip. She still wore her scrubs, the soft blue fabric wrinkled from hours of movement. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, a few strands loose around her face, and there was a heaviness in her posture that came from being on her feet all day. She set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and exhaled as though she'd been holding her breath since she left that morning. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice tired but warm. "Hey, Ma." Jamal glanced up from his notebook, offering a small smile. She moved to the counter, pouring herself a glass of water before leaning against it. "You eat yet?" "Just about to," he said, nodding toward the microwave. She nodded back, taking a long sip before setting the glass down. "School good?" "Yeah." He kept his tone even, eyes dropping back to his homework. She studied him for a moment, reading his face the way only a mother could. "You get to the court today?" "Yeah," he said again, flipping a page in his notebook like it was nothing worth mentioning. "Anyone else there?" He shook his head. "Just me." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. There had been a time when it was just him. He just left out the rest. He didn't feel like telling her about the older boys, about the challenge, about how hard they'd played. She didn't need to worry about him getting into something with kids she didn't know. The microwave beeped, and he stood to take his plate out, the warmth curling around his fingers. Renee watched him for another second before heading down the hall toward her room. "Don't stay up too late," she called over her shoulder. "I won't," he said. Setting the plate on the table, the apartment settled into its usual nighttime. Quiet, the kind that made every sound fork against plate, pencil against paper feel louder than it was. Jamal ate in slow bites, his eyes drifting toward the bag by the door, the ball resting on top. Out there, under the lights, he'd proven something to himself. But in here, life was the same as it had been when he left that morning. Homework. On the table, his mom worn down from work. And a game that was his alone to keep. Marcus sat in the driver's seat of his car, the engine off, the faint glow from the street lamps spilling across the dashboard. The quiet after leaving the court was familiar to him, the kind of stillness that let his thoughts line up in order. He'd watched kids play before, dozens, maybe hundreds, but there was something about this one that stayed in his mind longer than usual. It wasn't just the skill, though, that was there, raw and unshaped. It was the way the boy moved, the way he played without any audience, no hint of performing for someone's approval. That was rare. He pulled his phone from his pocket, leaning back in the seat as he scrolled through his contacts. His thumb stopped on a name he hadn't called in a couple of months. Coach Williams. They'd known each other since Marcus's rookie years, when Williams was running a small training program for neighborhood kids and Marcus had volunteered during the off-season. Over time, Williams had built that program into one of the most respected youth leagues in the city, still small compared to the big-name organizations, but real. No politics, no false promises, just the game, taught right. Marcus pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Marcus Hale, I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." A faint smile touched Marcus's mouth. "You still breathing, old man? Still running circles around kids who think they know basketball," Williams said, chuckling. "What's got you calling at this hour?" Marcus glanced toward the empty street, the faint rattle of the chain-link fence in the distance. I saw someone tonight. A kid, 14, maybe 15. He's got something, coach. Something like what? Williams asked, and Marcus could hear the shift in his tone, half interest, half skepticism. Instinct, Marcus said simply. The kind you don't teach. He moves like the ball's part of him. Doesn't play for show. Plays like it's just him and the rim, like the rest of the world doesn't matter. That's a rare thing, Williams said after a pause. Yeah, Marcus agreed. That's why I'm calling. I want to know more about him. Who he is, where he's from, if he's playing anywhere organized. And ask him yourself. Marcus shook his head, though Williams couldn't see it. Not yet. I don't want him playing different because he knows someone's watching. Kids change when they think they've got an audience, especially when they know who that audience is. Williams let out a low hum of thought. You're saying you want me to go in quiet? Exactly. No names, no mention of me. Just see what you can find out. There was a moment of silence on the other end, the kind that came when Williams was weighing the request. All right, he said finally. Describe him. Marcus leaned back further, letting the image of the boy form clearly in his mind. Tall for his age, lean, hoodie and sneakers that look like they've been through a war. One lace gray, one white. Shoes held together with black tape. Plays at the old court near Alder in 9th. I know the place, Williams said. Haven't been there in a while. Too many people hanging around who don't care about basketball. This kid cares, Marcus said firmly. More than anyone else I've seen there in years. Williams exhaled slowly. All right, I'll see what I can dig up. But I'm telling you now, Marcus, if he's got the kind of story you think he does, you're not going to want to stay in the shadows for long. Maybe, Marcus said. But for now, I just want to know who I'm dealing with. They said their goodbyes, and Marcus ended the call, setting the phone down on the passenger seat. The night was still quiet, the street as empty as when he'd pulled up earlier, somewhere out there. The kid was probably home, maybe eating dinner, maybe doing homework. Marcus started the engine, the low rumble filling the silence. As he drove away, the image of the boy on the court stayed with him, sharp and unshakable. He didn't know where this would lead yet, but he knew he wasn't done watching. Not by a long shot. The school gym smelled faintly of varnished wood and the faint temps of sweat that seemed to cling no matter how often the place was cleaned. The squeak of sneakers echoed in sharp bursts, bouncing off the high rafters, mixed with the hollow thud of basketballs hitting the floor. It was third period pay, and most of the class was going through the motions, half-hearted dribbles. Lazy passes, a few kids leaning against the wall talking instead of playing. But in the middle of it all, Jamal was moving like the game was the only thing in the world worth his attention. Coach Williams stood near the doorway, leaning against the frame with his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his windbreaker. He didn't wear anything that would give away who he was. No team polo, no clipboard, nothing official. To anyone else, he looked like a man waiting to speak to the gym teacher about something unimportant. His eyes, however, were locked on Jamal. He watched the boy dribble up the court during a scrimmage, weaving around two classmates without breaking stride. The movements were quick, instinctive. He wasn't thinking about how to get past them. He was just doing it like the ball was an extension of his hands. Williams noticed how Jamal's head was always up, scanning the floor, aware of where everyone else was. That was rare in someone his age. Most kids focused only on their own next move. The PE teacher blew the whistle, calling for a reset. Jamal jogged back to the baseline, his mismatched laces flapping slightly with each step. Williams caught the detail Marcus had described, the shoes wrapped in black tape, the frayed edges of his hoodie cuffs. It wasn't hard to see that the boy wasn't playing with much, yet it didn't seem to matter to him. When the scrimmage started again, Jamal caught the inbound pass and immediately spotted a teammate open near the basket. He sent the ball in a crisp bounce pass between two defenders, landing it perfectly in the other kid's hands. The shot missed, but Williams barely registered that. He was watching the decision-making, the quick read of the play, the unselfish pass that most kids at this level wouldn't think to make. The game went on like that, small bursts of speed, smart choices, quick hands on defense. Jamal wasn't the biggest or the loudest on the court, but the game seemed to flow differently. When the ball was in his possession, Williams stayed where he was, blending into the background, making mental notes. When the final whistle blew, the class started drifting toward the locker room, chattering and laughing. Jamal grabbed the ball he'd been using and rolled it toward the rack before slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Williams stepped forward just enough to catch him before he reached the door. "Hey," Williams said, his tone easy, almost casual. "You play outside of school?" Jamal paused, wary. "Sometimes."
Oh.
Williams nodded like that was the answer he expected. "I run a youth league. Good competition, real games, coaches who know what they're doing. We've got tryouts coming up this weekend." Jamal hesitated, shifting the weight of his bag. "It costs money, usually." Williams said honestly, "But for the right players, we find ways to make it work." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card with the league's name and his phone number on it. "Come by, see what you think." Jamal took the card, but didn't promise anything. "I'll think about it." Williams smiled faintly. "Do that. I'll be there." Then he stepped aside, letting Jamal leave without another word. Housed, the boy disappeared into the hallway. Williams knew Marcus had been right. There was something here, something worth pulling into the right place before the wrong. People noticed first. The card felt heavier than it should have, its corners softening slightly from being turned over in Jamal's pocket all day. He'd pulled it out a few times between classes, staring at the bold print of the league's name, the phone number beneath it, and the clean logo in the corner. It looked official, more official than anything he'd ever been invited to before. That should have made him feel proud, but instead it left him with a knot sitting low in his stomach. By the time the final bell rang, he'd already decided he wasn't going to call. He walked home with his hood up, the late afternoon light. Catching in the taped edges of his sneakers, thought kept circling. Youth leagues weren't free. They came with fees for registration, uniforms, travel. He'd seen the way kids from other neighborhoods rolled up to games bags stuffed with gear, fresh shoes that looked like they came straight out of the box. Couldn't picture himself showing up in what he had now at home. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. His mother's note was on the counter again, her handwriting tilted and hurried. "Working late, dinner in the fridge, love you." He took out the foil-covered plate and set it on the table, but didn't eat right away. Instead, he sat there tapping the corner of the card against the table, listening to the faint sound it made. Joining that league would mean asking her for more than she could give. Renee was already stretched, thin, working extra shifts at the hospital. Coming home with her feet so sore she'd wince when she kicked off her shoes. She didn't complain, but Jamal noticed the way she rubbed her temples when she thought he wasn't looking, or how she hesitated before swiping her card at the grocery store. The idea of adding another expense, even for something as important to him as basketball, felt selfish. He thought about the travel, too. The gym coach Williams had mentioned wasn't close. It would mean rides or bus fare, maybe both. Sometimes games were held across the city, maybe even out of town. He pictured the two of them figuring out how to make that work. His mother rearranging shifts, him feeling guilty for pulling her in two directions. When she came home that night, tired, but smiling, he kept the card in his pocket. They talked over dinner about school, about a funny thing one of her coworkers had said, about the weather turning colder. He didn't mention the tryout, didn't say anything about Coach Williams or the way he'd been watching him play. It was easier to keep it to himself, to convince himself that the opportunity wasn't really for someone like him anyway. Later, in his room, Jamal lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the card resting on the nightstand. He imagined what it might be like to walk into that gym full of other players to run drills under real coaches, to play on a team that had matching uniforms and actual plays, instead of just improvised moves on a cracked outdoor court. For a few minutes, the thought made him feel lighter, like it was almost possible. But then the other thoughts crept back, and how much it would cost. How different he'd look from the rest of the kids, how it would feel to have his mother sacrifice. Even more just so he could chase something that might not lead anywhere. He reached over, flipped the card face down, and told himself it was better this way. Sleep didn't come easy. Even with his eyes closed, he kept seeing the gym in his head, the echo of a ball hitting polished wood, the sound of a whistle cutting through the air. It was tempting enough to hurt, and that was exactly why he'd already decided to let it go. The morning air was sharp when Jamal stepped out into the hallway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the basketball under his arm. He was halfway through locking the door when he noticed a plain brown box sitting just to the side of the doormat. It wasn't there the night before. No writing on the outside, except for a printed shipping label with his name, which immediately made him pause. He didn't get packages. Ever. He glanced up and down the hallway. It was empty, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the muffled sound of a TV from somewhere down the hall. He bent down, lifted the box, and felt how light it was. The tape across the top was still sealed. Inside the apartment, he set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment before finally tearing the tape open. The flaps folded back, and for a second he thought he was imagining things. Nestled inside were a pair of brand new basketball shoes, real ones. It's not the clearance bin kind with mismatched colors, but the kind he'd only ever seen in store windows or on the feet of kids who never had to think about how much they cost. Black with deep red accents, still smelling faintly of leather and factory glue. The soles were untouched, the laces perfectly coiled, each shoe wrapped in crisp tissue paper. He reached in and picked one up, turning it in his hands. Size 10, exactly his size. That made him pause again. There was no card, no note, nothing to explain where they'd come from or who had sent them. He checked the box again, even flipped it over in case something had slipped between the flaps, but it was just the shoes. The first feeling was suspicion. Things like this didn't just show up for people like him. If it was from someone he knew, why wouldn't they say so? If it was from the league coach Williams mentioned, why wouldn't they tell him directly? And if it was from someone he didn't know, he wasn't sure how to feel about that. But as he ran his thumb over the smooth surface of the shoe, that suspicion gave way to something warmer. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had anything brand new, let alone something like this. His taped-up sneakers sat by the door, worn thin, the soles flaring at the edges like they were about to split for good. He thought about how it would feel to run the court in something that didn't fight against him with every step, to plant his foot for a shot and not worry about sliding. He carried the box to his room and set it on the bed. The shoes looked almost too good to touch, like they belonged in a display case. He laced one up slowly, tightening it around his foot, feeling how snug and light it was compared to the weight of his old ones. He stood, took a few steps across the room, then a quick pivot. The grip on the floor was perfect. For a moment, the excitement surged enough that he forgot to be cautious. He imagined walking into the court that evening, the older boys noticing, maybe even stopping their smirks for once. He imagined taking a shot and feeling that clean, solid push from the ground without worrying about his shoe falling apart mid-play. Still, the question of who stayed in the back of his mind kept looking toward the box, half expecting a note to appear that hadn't been there before. Nothing, just the shoes. Waiting, when he left for school, he didn't wear them. Not yet. They stayed in the box on his bed, as if putting them on too soon might break the spell. But he knew one thing for sure: whoever had sent them, for whatever reason, had just made it impossible for him to keep pretending he wasn't going to that tryout. The gym buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the echo of basketballs hitting polished wood. The air was warmer than outside, carrying the faint smell of rubber soles and freshly cleaned floors. Jamal stepped through the double doors, his backpack over one shoulder, the new shoes on his feet. He felt them with every step light, snug, nothing like the taped-up sneakers he'd worn for years. They gripped the floor differently, gave him a bounce he wasn't used to. The court was already full of kids warming up, some taller, some bulkier, most of them in fresh gear that looked straight off the store shelf. Jamal kept his eyes forward as he walked toward the far end of the gym. He didn't want to give anyone the chance to look too long at him, but even as he found a spot to start dribbling, he could feel a few pairs of eyes on him, not because of the shoes, they weren't loud or flashy, but because of the way he moved. Up in the bleachers, Marcus Hale sat a few rows from the floor, dressed in a black jacket and jeans, blending into the scattered parents and coaches. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, watching. The boy didn't seem to notice him good. He wanted to see him in his element, no awareness of who was sitting in the stands. Coach Williams blew a whistle, calling everyone into a huddle at center court. Jamal jogged over, slipping in near the back. Williams laid out the format: warm-ups, drills, short scrimmages, no cuts today, just evaluation. Still, the tension in the room was sharp enough to feel. For some of these kids, this was the difference between playing organized ball or not playing at all. They started with dribbling lines. Jamal took his place, ball in hand, eyes fixed ahead. When his turn came, he dropped into a low stance, weaving the ball between his legs, crossing over with speed and control that came from hours alone on cracked concrete. His movements weren't fancy, no extra flourishes, but they were clean, efficient. A few players in line behind him murmured to each other. Next came shooting drills. Groups spread out to different spots along the perimeter. Jamal's first. Few shots were cautious, testing the feel of the new shoes, the spring they gave him on his release. Then he found his rhythm. The ball left his hands in a smooth arc, hitting the rim just enough to drop through with a soft swish. He stepped two sharper angles, sinking shots from spots where other players hesitated. Marcus watched closely. Boy's form wasn't textbook, but there was something else just meant. He didn't take the same shot twice. Each release shifted slightly, reacting to his position. The ball's spin, the defender's reach. That was instinct, not something you could program. The scrimmages started, and Jamal's team was thrown together from kids who'd never played together before. The first possessions were messy forced passes, missed assignments, but Jamal adapted quickly. He read the flow of the game, cutting into open lanes, finding teammates with sharp bounce passes that landed exactly where they needed to. When he took the ball himself, he didn't rush. He drove when the lane opened, pulled back when it didn't, always keeping the defender guessing. Midway through, he caught a pass just outside the arc. His defender was taller, with a longer reach, but Jamal gave a quick head fake, took one hard dribble, stepped back into open space. The shot left his hands clean, the ball spinning high before dropping through the net. A few voices in the bleachers called out in approval. Jamal didn't react. He was already moving back on defense. By the time the whistle blew to end the game, he was breathing hard but steady. He jogged to the sideline, grabbed his water, and listened as Williams called out the next rotation. Marcus leaned back in his seat, a faint smile ghosting his face. He'd seen enough to know the boy belonged here. Jamal didn't need to know that just yet. From where Marcus sat, the kid still thought he was just another name on the roster today. But the way he played, the unshakable focus, the quiet command of the ball, told a different story. It was only a matter of time before everyone else in the gym saw it too. The next practice after tryouts felt different. Jamal walked into the gym with his new team, the sounds of bouncing balls and squeaking sneakers filling the air. Everyone was dressed in matching practice shirts now, numbers printed in bold white on the back. Jamal tugged at the hem of his, still getting used to the idea of being part of something organized. It felt strange, almost too polished compared to the dusty courts and street games he was used to. Coach Williams wasted no time. After a quick warm-up, he split them into two squads for scrimmages. Jamal was put at point guard, a position meant to lead the flow of the game. That should have felt like an honor, but instead it made his stomach tighten. In his world, the ball was something you held on to, something you kept under your control until you took the shot. Out there alone, it was always on him to make it happen. Now, surrounded by teammates, there was an expectation, pass, move, trust. The first possession told the story. Jamal brought the ball up the court, scanning for openings. But when one of his teammates signaled for a pass, Jamal hesitated. The defender stepped in, cutting off his lane. Forced to make a choice, he drove into traffic and lost the ball to a quick steal. The other team scored on the fast break before Jamal had even turned around. Williams blew his whistle, telling them to reset. Jamal nodded, but kept his eyes on the floor as they lined up again. On the next play, he tried to pass earlier, but it was rushed and off target, bouncing past his teammate and out of bounds. Frustration built in his chest. Passing in drills was one thing predictable: clean. Passing in a game, trusting that the person on the other end would see what he saw was something else entirely. From the bleachers, Marcus Hale watched closely. He saw the hesitation, the slight delay in Jamal's movements whenever the ball left his hands. It was the kind of thing that could kill a team's rhythm, but it wasn't stubbornness he was seeing, it was unfamiliarity. This was a kid who had spent years learning that no one else would carry the weight for him, and now he was expected to share it. Marcus knew how hard that adjustment could be. Back on the court, Jamal started finding small moments to make it work. He threw short, safe passes when the defense closed in, but his eyes always flicked toward the hoop, as if measuring whether he could take the shot himself. Sometimes he went for it, and when he did, the results were clean, sharp drives, smooth layups, quick pull-up jumpers. But those moments were scattered between cautious pauses, his grip tightening on the ball when a teammate called for it. The scrimmage stretched on, and Jamal could feel his own frustration growing. His team was trailing, and part of him wanted to take over completely, to forget the plays and just do what he knew best. But every time he looked over at Coach Williams, he caught the man's steady gaze, reminding him without words that this wasn't about proving he could win alone. In the final minutes, Jamal took a deep breath and tried something different. Bringing the ball up, he drew the defender toward him, then made a quick bounce pass to the teammate cutting along the baseline. The pass connected, and the shot dropped. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. The bench clapped, and one of the older players gave him a quick nod. Marcus noticed the shift. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was the first step toward trusting the people around him. As the scrimmage ended and the players headed for the water cooler, Jamal still carried the quiet weight of someone learning a new language. For the first time, though, he wasn't holding the ball quite so tightly. The envelope was thin. The paper inside carried a weight that filled the apartment. Renee stood by the kitchen counter with it in her hands, her thumb pressing along the crease where she'd just torn it open. Jamal was in his room, half listening to the faint crinkle of paper as he packed his bag for the next day. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the silence that followed was sharp enough to pull his attention from the hallway. He heard her sigh, long, heavy, the kind that didn't need words to explain, stepped out quietly, his sneakers muffled. Against the worn carpet, she didn't notice him at first. Her eyes were fixed on the letter, scanning lines he couldn't see. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. "What's that?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Renee looked up quickly, stucking the paper halfway under another envelope on the counter. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes, Jamal didn't push, but the edge in her voice made his chest tighten. He'd lived with her long enough to recognize when something was wrong, and the way she avoided his gaze told him plenty. Still, he crossed to the fridge and opened it, pretending to look for something, giving her space to either explain or stay quiet. She chose the latter, walking past him toward the hallway. When she was gone, he glanced back at the counter. The paper wasn't fully hidden. He could see the heading in bold letters, "Notice of overdue rent." That was all it took. He shut the fridge without taking anything, the cool air replaced by the warm weight of what he'd just read. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the basketball resting in the corner. Practice was tomorrow. The youth league had been everything he'd hoped for so far, but now it felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. Even if the fees had been covered somehow, there were still the bus rides. The time away from home, the extra meals he grabbed on the go, all of it added up. He thought about the shoes, how they'd just appeared, how he still didn't know who had sent them. It felt like a gift he hadn't earned, not when his mom was working double shifts and still coming home to overdue notices. If he quit the league, he could get a part-time job after school, maybe help cover some bills. It wouldn't be much, but it would be something. That night, Renee came in later than usual, the smell of antiseptic still clinging to her scrubs. Jamal was at the table, his homework spread out but untouched. She dropped her bag by the door and gave him a tired smile. "You're still up?" "Yeah," he said. He wanted to ask her about the letter, but the words stuck in his throat. She looked so drained, her shoulders sagging as she poured herself a glass of water. "You've got practice tomorrow, right?" she asked, sipping slowly. He hesitated. "Yeah, I guess." She looked at him over the rim of her glass. You guess? What's that mean? He shrugged, trying to make it sound offhand. Just thinking maybe I should take a break. I'd focus on school, maybe. Pick up some work. Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. Jamal, you're 14. Your job is school and doing what you love. The rest, she stopped, glancing toward the hallway where the letter was still on the counter. The rest is my problem. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. As she disappeared into her room, he sat there a little longer, the thought lingering like a shadow he couldn't shake. Walking away from basketball might be the only way to help. And the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the right thing to do, even if it was the last thing he wanted. Practice had just ended, and the echo of the final whistle was still bouncing off the gym walls when Jamal grabbed his water bottle and slung his bag over his shoulder. Most of the players were already drifting toward the locker room, talking about weekend plans or rehashing the scrimmage they'd just finished. Jamal stayed behind for a moment, bending to retie one of his laces, giving himself a few extra seconds before joining the noise. He didn't notice the man sitting quietly on the bottom row of the bleachers, till the room had mostly emptied. The figure stood, hands in the pockets of a black hoodie, and started walking toward the court. His steps were unhurried, but there was something steady about the way he moved, like he belonged there. You've got a good handle, the man said, his voice even, the kind of weight that made you pay attention without realizing why. Jamal straightened slowly, his bag still slung over one shoulder. Thanks, he said, cautious. He didn't recognize the man, and there was no obvious reason for him to be there. The man stopped just a few feet away. Ever play one-on-one? Jamal gave a short laugh. Yeah, sometimes. Right now. The man tilted his head toward the hoop at the far end. 1st to 7. No refs, no crowd, just us. Jamal hesitated, glancing toward the locker room door. He wasn't sure if this was normal, some stranger challenging him to a game, but there was something in the man's tone that wasn't threatening, just confident. All right, he said finally, dropping his bag by the sideline. They took positions, Jamal with the ball first. He started with a cautious dribble, testing the man's stance. The guy was taller, broad in the shoulders, but he moved lightly. On his feet, Jamal went for a quick crossover, but the man slid in front of him with surprising speed. Don't telegraph the move, the man said, not breaking position. Sell it with your shoulders before the ball moves. Jamal tried again, this time adding a subtle shift in his upper body before switching hands. It worked. He slipped past and laid the ball in. Better, the man said, retrieving the rebound. He took the ball out, checked it to Jamal, and began his own drive. His movements were smooth, efficient, no wasted energy. He faked a shot, pulled back, and sent the ball through the net with a clean flick of his wrist. They traded points. And each time Jamal had the ball, the man dropped a small piece of advice. Keep your eyes up, see the court, not just your... Man, your first step's good, but you're not using your offhand enough. Plant your foot harder on the cut. It'll give you more lift. Jamal listened without thinking about it, adjusting as they went. The tips made sense instantly, and he could feel the difference in how his moves landed. By the time they were tied at 6, sweat was running down both their faces. Jamal was breathing hard but steady. On the final possession, Jamal caught the ball just outside the arc. He gave a quick jab step, pulled the ball back, and launched. The shot, it hit clean, rattling the chain net before dropping through. The man smiled faintly, nodding. You've got more in you than you think. Jamal picked up the ball, still catching his breath. You a coach or something? Something like that, the man said, glancing toward the exit. Keep showing up like you did today, and you'll figure the rest out. Before Jamal could ask more, the man was already walking toward the door, his steps unhurried, like there was no rush to reveal anything more. Jamal stood there for a moment, ball in hand, wondering who he'd just played and why it felt like that game had mattered more than most. The next week's practice was already in full swing when Jamal jogged into the gym, the sound of sneakers squeaking against the polished floor echoing in his ears. He had been thinking about that one-on-one game all week, replaying the way the man had moved, the calm authority in his voice, the way each tip had fit perfectly into the flow of the game. He hadn't seen him again since, but the advice had stuck. His passes were sharper now, his cuts more decisive. Coach Williams had them running full-court drills, the pace quick and relentless. Jamal was in the middle of a fast break when one of his teammates, Darnell, caught up beside him. "Man," Darnell said between breaths, "I didn't know Marcus Hale was coming today." Jamal passed the ball down the court, jogging to reset. "Who?" he asked. Darnell's eyes widened, like Jamal had just said he didn't know what basketball was. "You don't know who Marcus Hale is? You serious?" Before Jamal could answer, Darnell nodded toward the far end of the bleachers. Jamal followed. His gaze and his stomach gave a strange, quick jolt. There, sitting with the same unhurried posture, was the man from the 101. Black jacket, jeans, calm expression. He wasn't blending into the background now. Several parents and even some players were sneaking glances at him, whispering to each other. "That's Marcus Hale," Darnell said, like the name itself carried weight. Played 12 seasons. In the league, won 2 championships. Dude's a legend. Retired a few years back and started that foundation for youth players. You seriously didn't know? Jamal's mouth went dry. He watched Marcus lean forward, elbows on his knees, eyes following the game, just like they had followed Jamal on the court that night. The realization hit slowly but firmly. Every detail from their game sliding into place, the perfect footwork, the way he'd read each move before it happened, the casual authority in his advice. He'd played one-on-one with an NBA champion and hadn't even known. The next drill started, but Jamal's focus felt split. He drove into the lane, sank a layup, and as he jogged back, his eyes flicked to the bleachers again. Marcus's expression didn't change, but there was a slight nod, just enough for Jamal to know it was meant for him. Between drills, Darnell kept talking, rattling off stats and stories. Man, he used to kill it from the three-point line. And his defense? Forget about it. People would switch just to avoid him, and now he's here watching us. That's wild. Jamal barely heard the rest. He was still replaying that night, wondering why Marcus had kept his name to himself. Maybe he didn't want the weight of who he was to change the game. Maybe he'd wanted to see how Jamal would play without the pressure. When practice wrapped, most of the players drifted toward Marcus, eager for handshakes or a quick photo. Jamal hung back, unsure if he should join them. Eventually Marcus stood, speaking briefly to Coach Williams before making his way toward the exit. Just before he reached the doors, he looked over his shoulder, catching Jamal's eye. It wasn't an invitation exactly, more like an acknowledgement, a quiet way of saying, "I see you." Jamal felt the corner of his mouth lift, though his heart was still thudding. He didn't run after him, not yet. But the awe and disbelief sat heavy. In his chest, tangled with something else, curiosity. If Marcus Hale had noticed him once, maybe it meant he'd notice again. And now that Jamal knew who he was, he wanted to make sure he gave him something worth noticing. It was a Thursday evening when Jamal walked out of practice and saw Marcus leaning against a black SUV parked at the curb. The spring air was cool, and the street was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic a block away. Marcus straightened when he saw him, the same calm, unreadable expression he'd worn in the gym. "Got a minute?" he asked. Jamal nodded, though his curiosity was sharp enough to feel in his chest. "Yeah." Marcus opened the passenger door. "Hop in. I'd like to talk to you and your mom over dinner. Nothing fancy, just conversation." Jamal hesitated, then climbed in, the leather seats cool under him. Marcus waited until they were moving before he said anything else. "You've been putting in the work? I see it every time I'm there. That's not just talent, that's discipline. And discipline is worth investing in." They pulled up in front of Jamal's apartment building, and Marcus stayed in the car while Jamal ran upstairs to get his mother. Renee opened the door wearing a plain sweater, her hair pulled back, the tired lines of her day still on her face. When Jamal told her Marcus wanted to talk, she gave him a look that mixed suspicion with a flicker of concern. "Who is this man?" she asked quietly. "He's a former NBA player," Jamal said, still not entirely used to the words. "He's been watching me play." "Just hear him out?" Renee's hesitation was clear in the way she glanced toward the hallway, toward the pile of unopened mail on the counter. But she grabbed her coat and followed him downstairs. Dinner was at a small, family-run restaurant a few blocks away. The lighting was warm, the low murmur of conversation filling the space. They slid into a booth, Marcus across from them. He didn't waste time. "I'll start by saying, I'm not here to sell you anything," Marcus said. "I run a foundation that helps young athletes with potential players who have the drive but not the resources.
We cover training costs,
Gear, league fees. We also provide mentorship, academic support, and, when needed, travel expenses for tournaments." Renee's hands were folded on the table, her expression steady but guarded. "And why Jamal?" Marcus met her eyes. "Because I've been around the game long enough to know when I see someone who could go far if given the right tools. Your son is one of those people. He's raw, sure, but his work ethic is already better than half the players I've coached." Jamal sat quietly looking between them. He'd never heard anyone talk about him like that before, not in front of his mother. Renee tilted her head slightly. "What's the catch?" "There isn't one," Marcus said. "We're not buying his loyalty. He's free to make his own choices about his future. We just remove some of the barriers so he can focus on playing and developing. Like, to start by getting him into a specialized training program. It's covering his current league fees and replacing his gear when he needs it." Renee's fingers tapped lightly against the table. "I've seen people promise things to kids before," she said slowly. "It doesn't always end well." "I know," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "That's why we do everything transparently. To have access to all the details every step of the way. If at any point you don't like how it's going, you can walk away. No obligation." The food arrived, breaking the tension for a moment. Jamal picked at his plate, his mind spinning. The thought of not having to worry about the cost of the league, of having better equipment, of training with real coaches, it was almost too much to picture. Renee stayed quiet for a few minutes, eating in measured bites. Finally, she set her fork down. "I'm not saying yes tonight," she said. "But I'll listen. I'll read whatever paperwork you have. If this is really as you say, then maybe we can talk about it." Marcus nodded, no push in his tone. "That's all I ask." When they left the restaurant, the night air felt different, lighter somehow. Though Jamal knew his mother's mind was still weighing the risks. For the first time, though, the possibility of something bigger didn't feel so far away. The gym was louder than anything Jamal had experienced before. The steady hum of conversation he was used to at practices had been replaced with a constant roar, parents shouting, sneakers squealing on polished wood, whistles cutting sharp through the air. Rows of folding chairs lined the sidelines, filled with families holding homemade signs and players from other teams waiting for their turn. The banners hanging from the rafters made the place feel bigger, more official, and for the first time since joining the league, Jamal felt the weight of where he was. His team was already warming up when he stepped onto the court, the bright lights making the floor shine almost like glass. He could feel the newness of his uniform against his skin, the number on his back heavy with meaning. Marcus was there, seated a few rows behind the bench, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, tracking every movement. Jamal caught his gaze for just a second and got a small nod and returned steady. Grounding, but not enough to quiet the nerves twisting in his stomach. The first quarter was rough. Jamal's hands felt tight around the ball, his dribble higher than it should have been, his passes just a beat too late. The other team's defense was quick, swarming him every time he touched the ball. He missed 2 open shots in the first few minutes, each one followed by that low groan from the crowd that made his ears burn. Coach Williams called a timeout, pulling the players into a tight huddle. "Settle down," Williams said, looking directly at Jamal. "You're letting the game get ahead of you. Slow your mind down. One possession at a time."
Yeah?
Jamal nodded, but the words felt distant under the pounding of his heart. When play resumed, he tried to reset, but the pressure was still there. A steal he should have seen coming turned into an easy layup for the other team, and by the end of the quarter, they were down by 8. On the bench, Jamal took a long drink from his water bottle, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. That's when he heard Marcus's voice steady, cutting through the noise without shouting. "You know how to play this game. Stop thinking about them and start playing your game." It wasn't even loud enough for anyone else to hear, but it landed. Jamal glanced back and saw Marcus leaning forward, elbows on his knees. Watching him like nothing that had happened so far was enough to shake his belief. When Jamal checked back in for the second quarter, something in him shifted. The noise in the gym was still there, but it wasn't crashing over him anymore. He kept the ball lower, moving it faster, trusting his instincts instead of second-guessing. On one play, he cut to the basket without hesitation, catching a pass and finishing the layup before the defense could collapse. The next possession, he drove in and kicked the ball out to a teammate for an open three. The rhythm came back piece by piece. By halftime, the score was closer, and Jamal's nerves had settled into focus. In the third quarter, he hit a mid-range jumper that brought the crowd to its feet, and this time, the sound didn't rattle him, fueled him. He could hear Marcus's clap from the sideline, distinct from the rest. Measured but full of approval, the game stayed close until the final minutes. With 30 seconds left and the score tied, Jamal brought the ball up the court. He faked left, crossed over right, and pulled up just inside the arc. The shot sailed clean, the net snapping as the ball dropped through. The opposing team's final possession ended in a missed three, and the buzzer echoed like a release of everything that had been building inside him since the game began. As his teammates celebrated, slapping his back and shouting, Jamal looked toward the bleachers. Marcus was still in his seat, smiling faintly, nodding once like he'd known all along this was how it would go. And for the first time all day, Jamal believed it too. The Monday after the tournament, the school day felt different. Through the halls with his backpack slung over one shoulder, but instead of the usual nods from friends and the occasional pat on the back from teammates, there were more eyes on him. A few kids he barely knew pointed in his direction, whispering to each other. Someone in the cafeteria said they'd seen a clip of his game on their cousin's Facebook feed. He didn't think much of it until he got home and saw his mother sitting at the kitchen table with the local paper spread open in front of her. Across the sports section, in color, was a photo of him mid-jump shot, the ball leaving his fingertips. The crowd behind him blurred. Above it, the headline read, "Local Teen Shines in Youth League Debut." The article wasn't long, but it mentioned his game-winning shot, his strong second-half performance, and his potential for future tournaments. It even quoted Coach Williams, who called him a natural talent with an incredible work ethic. Renee didn't say much, but Jamal noticed the small smile she tried to hide as she slid the paper toward him. "You didn't tell me they were taking pictures," she said. "I didn't know," he replied, looking at his own face frozen in that moment. It felt strange, like it wasn't really him in the picture, just some version of him caught between breaths. Later that evening, his phone buzzed with messages from friends, teammates, and even a few kids from other schools. Someone tagged him. In a post from the local news channel's website, an article that had picked up the story from the paper. It was more polished, with quotes from other players and a mention of how he'd been playing ball at the edge of town for years before joining the league. The next day, a reporter from the community sports blog showed up at practice. Him questions about the game, but also about his life where he learned to play, what kept him motivated. Jamal was careful with his answers, keeping them short, but she pressed gently. And before long, he was talking about the old court near his apartment, about playing alone until the streetlights flickered on, about the shoes he'd patched with tape until recently when the interview went live. The response surprised him. Neighbors he barely spoke to stopped him on the street to say they'd read it. Parents from other teams congratulated him after games. Even Mr. Carter, the owner of the corner store, told him the sodas were on the house just this once. After seeing his name online, Renee noticed it too. One evening, as she folded laundry, she told him she'd had 3 different coworkers at the hospital mention the article. "They're proud of you," she said, her tone soft but steady. "That means something in a place like this." The attention wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to shift the way people looked at him. The kids at the court started asking if they could run drills with him. A local church group reached out to invite him to a free skills camp they were hosting. In the summer, the community center offered him access to their indoor court during bad weather. Through it all, Marcus stayed quiet. He didn't step into the spotlight or take credit. But Jamal could feel his presence still, watching from the sidelines. Still. making sure the opportunities came without announcing where they started. 4. Jamal, the biggest change wasn't the newspaper or the interviews. It was walking onto the court, any court, and feeling like the work he'd been doing for years, out of sight. With no one to notice but himself, finally had a weight other people could see. The game was still the same. The ball still felt familiar in his hands, the sound of it bouncing still grounded him. But now, when he looked around, he saw more than empty fences and fading paint. He saw faces in the stands, eyes following his movement, a community leaning in. It wasn't fame, not even close. But it was the start of something that felt just as real a sense that he belonged, not just on the court, but in the story his neighborhood was beginning to tell about him. By the time spring settled into summer, the cracked pavement at the edge of town no longer looked the same. For years, that court had been a forgotten patch of asphalt. Its lines faded to ghostly outlines, its hoop bent just enough to send shots rattling off for no good reason. The chain-link fence had been patched, with mismatched sections of wire and weeds had always found their way through the fractures in the ground. But now, there was the low hum of change. It started with construction crews arriving early in the morning, their trucks parked along the curb where Jamal used to drop his backpack before playing until dusk. The workers unloaded rolls of fencing, stacks of boards, buckets of paint, and a brand new backboard wrapped in protective plastic. Jamal stood on the sidewalk the first day, unsure whether to step closer or keep his distance. He didn't need anyone to tell him Marcus was behind it. No one else would bother with a place like this. Over the next few weeks, the transformation unfolded. The surface was stripped and resurfaced, smoothed into a clean, even stretch that gleamed under the sun. Fresh white lines appeared, sharp and bright, marking the boundaries Jamal had learned to play without. The old hoop was replaced with a sturdy, gleaming rim, its net crisp and white, swaying slightly in the breeze. The fence stood straight again, no longer leaning in spots where the posts had rusted through. Every day after practice, Jamal would swing by watching the progress. Sometimes Marcus would be there, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, saying little but glancing over with that same steady look he'd given from the bleachers months ago. There were no speeches, no public announcement of his involvement, just quiet coordination and the sort of follow-through that spoke louder than any headline. When the work was done, the court didn't just look new, it felt alive. The surface had a faint rubber bounce underfoot, the kind that made every dribble sound sharper. The paint was so fresh it seemed to glow under the streetlights. Kids from the neighborhood, some Jamal's age, some younger, crowded in on the first evening it reopened. There were new balls donated to the community center and left in a metal rack by the gate. It's free for anyone to use. At the far end of the court, mounted on the fence, was a plaque. The metal caught the afternoon. Light and Jamal approached it slowly, reading the words once. Then again, in honor of Jamal Harris, whose love for the game began here. May this court remind every player that greatness can start anywhere. There was no mention of Marcus's name, no nod to his career, his titles, or his role in making it happen. Jamal understood instantly that was the point. This was a court for the kids who'd play here after him, the ones who'd show up with nothing but a ball and a dream, just like he had. The name on the plaque was meant to tell them they could belong here too. That evening, Jamal played the first pickup game. On the new court, the ball bounced cleaner, the shots felt truer, and the crowd of kids around the fence cheered at every score. Renee came to watch, standing near Marcus, who kept his eyes on the game. When Jamal sank a shot from the corner, he glanced over and caught Marcus smiling, not the faint, knowing smile he'd worn before, but something wider, as if even he couldn't hide his pride anymore. The court would go on to see countless games, arguments over fouls, kids practicing in the rain, and friends staying long after sunset. And every time Jamal walked past that plaque, he felt the weight of what it meant, not as a reminder of where he'd been, but as a promise for where others could go.